Debt is usually sold as something boring, a number, a contract, a promise to pay later. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Debt is not just money. Debt is control. And today, it is the most powerful political weapon on earth. Not tanks, not missiles, not even elections. Debt. Because if you control what someone owes, you quietly control what they can do next. Pause for a second. Right now, governments are falling, policies are changing, wars are being delayed, and entire populations are tightening their belts, not because they lost a war, but because they missed a payment. And most people don't even notice. This matters now because global debt has crossed $300 trillion. That's not a typo. $300 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the global economy. And here's the strange part. No one seems in charge. Yet somehow, the rules are always enforced. So, how did we get here? To understand how debt became a weapon, we need to stop thinking of it as money and start thinking of it as leverage. Originally, debt was simple. You borrow, you pay back. End of story. Kings borrowed to fight wars. Merchants borrowed to move goods. Farmers borrowed to survive bad harvests. If you couldn't pay, there were consequences, sometimes brutal ones, but they were personal and local. What changed wasn't debt itself, it was scale. In the 20th century, governments discovered something magical. They could borrow not just from people, but from the future. Modern governments issue bonds. These are promises. Lend us money now, and we'll pay you back later with interest. Sounds harmless, but here's the twist. Governments don't just borrow for emergencies anymore. They borrow to function. Budgets stopped balancing decades ago. Deficits became normal. Debt stopped being a temporary tool and became permanent infrastructure. And once debt becomes permanent, power shifts. Because the lender no longer asks, "Will you pay me back?" They ask, "What will you change to keep paying me?" This is where debt stops being financial and becomes political. Let's walk through how the system actually works, step by step. First, a government borrows. It issues bonds. Banks buy them. Pension funds buy them. Foreign governments buy them. At this point, the debt looks friendly. Everyone smiles. Interest rates are low. Money flows. Then something changes. Growth slows. A crisis hits. Tax revenue drops. Now the same debt suddenly looks dangerous. The government still has to pay. Interest doesn't care about recessions. Deadlines don't pause for elections. So the government faces a choice: raise taxes, cut spending, or borrow even more to survive. This is where power enters the room, because lenders start attaching conditions, not always explicitly, often quietly. Cut fuel subsidies, freeze public wages, privatize state assets, open markets, reduce social programs. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements disguised as fiscal responsibility. And the math behind it is cold. If a country spends more servicing debt than funding schools or hospitals, democracy becomes a formality. You can vote, but the budget is already spoken for. This is not theory. This has happened repeatedly. Latin America in the 1980s, Asia in the late 1990s, Europe after 2008. Entire national policies rewritten not by voters, but by creditors. And here's the irony. The public is told this is about discipline, responsibility, living within your means. But the underlying reality is very different. Debt crises are rarely caused by reckless citizens. They are caused by structural incentives. Politicians are rewarded for borrowing today. They're gone before repayment hurts. Banks earn interest whether the economy thrives or struggles, as long as payments continue. And global institutions are designed to protect the system, not the people inside it. So debt keeps growing, quietly, relentlessly. Now let's talk about the most uncomfortable part. Not all debt is treated equally. Some countries can drown in debt and survive. Others collapse at much lower levels. Why? Because debt isn't just about how much you owe, it's about who you owe and what currency you owe it in. Countries that borrow in their own currency have a hidden advantage. They can print, they can inflate, they can delay the pain. Countries that borrow in foreign currency don't get that luxury. They must earn dollars or euros or face default. That dependency is power. It means trade policy changes, foreign policy shifts, domestic priorities get reordered, not because someone invaded, but because the numbers demanded it. And this is where debt becomes a geopolitical tool. Lending isn't always about profit. Sometimes it's about influence. Financing infrastructure, funding development, offering help during crisis moments. The terms look generous at first, low interest, long timelines, but the leverage comes later. When a country can't pay, when refinancing becomes necessary, when strategic assets suddenly appear on the negotiating table. Ports, energy grids, mineral rights, voting alignment. Debt doesn't need to conquer territory, it just needs to outlast resistance. Now contrast this with how debt is talked about publicly. We're told that debt is abstract, too complex, a problem for economists. We're told markets are neutral, interest rates are natural, austerity is unavoidable. But behind the language is a very human reality. Debt transfers decision-making away from citizens and towards balance sheets. And the more indebted a system becomes, the less political freedom it actually has. Even powerful countries feel this pressure. Central banks hesitate, governments delay reforms, policy becomes reactive, not strategic. Everything is done to keep confidence alive. Because once confidence breaks, debt stops being manageable and starts being explosive. Zoom out even further. This system isn't collapsing tomorrow, but it's becoming more fragile every year. Higher interest rates mean higher servicing costs. Aging populations mean fewer taxpayers. Climate shocks add unpredictable expenses. Debt compounds, but trust doesn't. At some point, something has to give. Either debts are restructured, inflated away, or politically enforced through cuts and controls. None of those options are painless. All of them shift power. And here's the quiet truth most people never hear. Debt works best as a weapon when it doesn't look like one, when it feels technical, when it feels boring, when people argue about personalities instead of incentives. Because by the time the consequences show up in daily life, the contracts are already signed. So the next time you hear that a country has no choice, that markets are demanding reforms, that cuts are necessary, ask a different question. Who is owed? Who benefits? And who no longer gets to decide? Because debt doesn't just predict the future, it quietly votes on it. And once that vote is cast, reversing it is much harder than taking the loan in the first place. So here's the unresolved thought to sit with. If debt now shapes policy more than elections, if financial promises outlast political promises, then at what point does economic power stop serving democracy and start replacing it? And who decides where that line really is?